super excited to introduce our final AFS Alumni Founder of the semester, Zara Stasi. Upon graduating in 2012 with a degree in history and studio art, Zara was the head national greenhouse artist at Deloitte. So she traveled globally to bring art into facilitated sessions through experience design, facilitation, and visual capture. And she crafted this role for herself, which is really cool, after several years of being a UX consultant at Deloitte. And then in 2019, Zara founded Good for the Bees, where she's also the CEO. Good for the Bees is a New York City-based creative studio that uses art to help people thrive. Good for the Bees clients include, but are not limited to, Anthropology Europe, Deloitte, KPMG, Madewell, the New York City Department of Transportation, Columbia University, William & Mary, and Cartier. So thank you so much for joining us today, Zara. How are you doing? How is motherhood treating you?
Thank you for having me. It's treating me well. If you hear a baby in the background, that's why I have a new baby at home. But thank you for having me, Savannah. Excited to be here.
Great. So I guess to kick off our Q&A, if you just want to start from the beginning. So growing up, what were your interests and how do you see them kind of shaping the entrepreneurial side of yourself now?
Yeah, growing up, I was very much always interested in art in general. And I think when I was reflecting on this question, because I obviously have the questions ahead of time, I really at first couldn't answer it because I was like, I don't really think I was ever entrepreneurial as a kid. But when I really reflected, I realized that art was an interest. And the way I went after learning about art independently was definitely entrepreneurial. And what I mean by that is, for example, I sought out the couple artists in our small town, and my mom helped me coordinate studio visits because I was interested in what it actually took to be a working artist. And so I was like, I don't know, 11, 10, and going up and meeting these artists that like their whole life was creating and selling their work. And so from a really young age, I think I was very interested in what it would take to have art be part of my actual business life, even if I didn't know that's what it was called back then. But seeking out people who did the work already and asking a lot of questions of them was definitely something I look back at and realize I did all the time and was really focused on. So art was always part of it, but that kind of spirit of curiosity and like, how the heck do you do this? And, you know, asking those questions was definitely something I was born having interest in.
Yeah, awesome. I definitely see a little bit of self-direction there, which for those of you who are new to the Entrepreneurship Center, that's one of our pillars of entrepreneurial thinking, which I forgot to mention because that's what our questions are based off of. But for those of you online, Amanda's going to drop those in the chat because there's a few other questions relating to that. And then for those of you in person, we can see it on our wall over here. But yeah, definitely that's very entrepreneurial. I know you said you didn't see yourself as an entrepreneurial child, but definitely some entrepreneurship there. So then moving forward to your time at William & Mary, how do you think it shaped your personal and professional journey?
Well, the personal journey is very easy. I mean, from friendships and just kind of a network perspective, many of the folks I met at William & Mary are very influential in my life today, including my husband, and not limited to my husband. But when I think about my time at William & Mary, I think about it from a perspective of actually not diving super deep into art right away and being very curious as to like what else I could be interested in and kind of run for or be a part of. And so for me, William & Mary, when I reflect back on what I did, like how I spent my time there, it was super rich with like a variety of activities. And I think that that kind of cross section of being both a student leader, volunteer tour guide of Spotswood, like all these little things coming together really helped shape myself as a person that, you know, could understand kind of like stepping in the shoes of others. That's where I started to learn about truly what it means to be empathetic to kind of others along the journey. And I feel like, you know, from a professional standpoint, all of those tenets of how you work together on a team, how you collaborate across campus organizations, how you might lead in a really tough environment. All those things are really relevant to the work I do now, especially when I'm working with so many different stakeholders across many different clients, many of them, Fortune 10, Fortune 100 companies. I feel like that was born out of a seed of those like different types of leadership and just partnerships that I was part of on campus.
Yeah. William and Mary is definitely one of those places where you have to, yeah, like build relationships and partnerships. I feel like that's something that William and Mary really thrives off of and the type of students it attracts. But how did specifically the education and course load side of your William and Mary experience in history, in studio art, how did you kind of leverage those two things? Like, how did they relate for you?
You mean relate into like today's terms
Mhm.
generally? Okay.
Or
Uh,
together.
Excellent. It's interesting because when I think about my time and what I focused on, I totally went for majors that I was passionate about. So I wasn't someone who was like, oh, I really want to make sure I have this job coming out of school. So like, let me back up into the major that requires, that, will help me get set up for that job. Um, I had a couple ideas of what I might do with these majors and got totally rejected flat out from a couple of those opportunities, hilariously. And had opportunities that those folks came back to me later saying, "Oh, would you like to work with us?" But when I think about it, it was really more about following things I was interested in and figuring out how to make sense of that a little bit later, which not that I'm saying like that's the only path to go down, not recommending that by any means, but that's how I approached it. I wanted to study things I was interested in, knowing that I could do a lot of things and knowing that, I had confidence that I could go out and interview for different jobs and eventually figured out kind of my path through those jobs. But I think from a perspective of history specifically, one of the things that I liked about that was diving deep into a topic, right? So like going very deep in whether it was your research or working with, a team or partners to understand a topic. I see that come up in my visual capture work now when I might have a client reach out to me today about a session next week on a very deep, meaty topic. And I feel confident that I can do the work I need to kind of understand it enough that I can go into the room and capture it, without knowing what the conversation is going to be about, but just having that skill set of really being able to kind of comprehend information, synthesize it, make sense of it. I feel like that seed started with the kind of rigorous learning I did in the history department at William and Mary. But the connection of having that double major with studio art, obviously, it's a very different pace, right? So studio art as a major, if any of you are familiar or not familiar with it, you show up to class and might spend 3 hours looking at one model, focusing on like one part of a piece. And you might come back, 2 days later and redo the whole thing, right? It's very much about being in that flow state, being super observational. And I think that a lot of my work now comes back to that, being very susceptible to kind of observing the world, taking it in, making sense of it, and kind of pushing back something, my response to it. So the speed might be different when I think of my time at Deloitte, especially on the as like the founding member of the global team that did these facilitated sessions. That speed was crazy. You show up somewhere, set up a session, have clients in there, be listening, making sense of it. Post-its flying everywhere, like that vibe. But slowing down and really thinking about the synthesis and kind of how to make sense of stuff is where I found that I was excelling, in that area. And I think that kind of ties back to both that deep kind of taking the time to research and think that you learn in history, and then obviously that deep kind of observational flow state that you get from studio art, kind of coming back together, but existing in a very high stress business world, very, very high intensity, you know, very intense business world.
Yeah, absolutely. So you've talked a little bit about your time at Deloitte and becoming a founder. Do you mind kind of explaining that transition period from being at William and Mary and the steps leading up to deciding to launch Good for the Bees?
Yeah, of course. I think that pretty simply, senior year at William and Mary, I, in the fall, was exploring different paths for what was next. And one of the things that was important to me, because I did not have that one job I wanted at the end of school, that I was following for, I was really interested in getting kind of a wider view of the world and like what is out there. And so when different consulting groups came to campus, um, I just decided, let me apply and practice my interviewing skills. And like, consulting is kind of that big, kind of messy world view that you like get thrown into and then figure out problem solving around the world or in different instances. And so I went and interviewed at Deloitte and they came to campus, not expecting, anything much. I hadn't taken one business course, right? So, well, I took econ, but not a business course, I guess. But I think that approach to kind of going in and just being really curious and being like, this is how I think about problems. I'm going to answer your case study in the way it makes sense to me, right? Like that kind of vulnerability and potentially just like the honesty of being like, this is who I am. This is what I'm interested in. That I think really was engaging for the folks that I interviewed with. And they were really interested in how I approach problems because I was not coming from specifically like a very siloed business approach. And so that thread kind of continued through my time at Deloitte in that I was always a little bit othered on teams because I was coming from, a very liberal arts or specifically studio art background. So I was approaching problems, not like, hey, here's my Excel shortcut. I've worked in Excel. I was more like, I've never opened Excel, so like very much coming from a place that was very specific to me and my experience and not lying about that. That allowed me, though, to start to look at the problems I was seeing again and again as a consultant at Deloitte and figure out a way to bring my whole self to that work. Instead of saying, I have to be a superstar at using Excel, I was like, what am I good at? If I'm at home working through this problem, what do? I sketch it out. I start working through visuals that make sense of it. If I'm listening to someone talk, I'm drawing. So basically trusting that instinct and putting it out front and center at work was kind of step one. And realizing I really missed art all the time, but I was in this environment that actually needed a version of art for it to be stronger. And so I started to bring in art as a tool early when I was a consultant, mostly in sessions where people were talking like this or talking like at a round table, being like, how do we figure out what to do next? And I would get up and use the whiteboard or use paper and just kind of record the conversation in a visual way, right? Synthesize it down, make sense of it, and use visual cues to help people be on the same page. And so I started doing that, and that ended up being kind of like my second job on the side. But I realized I was interested in it enough to kind of make it a full-time job. And so what I started to do was look at Deloitte and honestly elsewhere and say, where does this exist? Where can I actually go practice this skill set even more? Because right now, I have a full-time job. It's very demanding, but I'm doing it on the side. How can I make this part of that journey a little bit more thoughtfully? By happenstance, I knew someone from one of my initiatives at Deloitte who knew that they were building up basically an innovation center. And so the Deloitte Greenhouse, which it's now called, was just kind of beginning when I was part of the consulting practice. And I interviewed with someone, I shared my portfolio of, visual capture or graphic facilitation. I call it visual capture. It's a little broader now, but at the time, graphic facilitation. So I had, photos of all my work pulled into a portfolio, very much like a studio art major would do. Shared it, pitched an idea to, do this, for her team. And she said, no, but we have these openings on the team if you want to interview for them. And the two openings I interviewed for were building up a team that would be deployed either across the US or globally to put on immersive facilitated sessions with executives. And she said, creativity would be a skill set that we definitely would welcome. It's not, necessarily, you don't have to be a drawer to do this work, but like you could bring it in, we could talk about it later kind of thing. And so I actually got both jobs and chose the global team. So I was like the first member of that team starting up. A couple weeks later, like, first time ever really being on the road globally, I was in Amsterdam facilitating a session, having never been a facilitator. So it was a very quick paced environment where you did intensive learning. Like there was always someone training you, always someone handing down knowledge to you, but also a ton of I don't know, go figure it out, mentality. And so, especially on the global stage where you don't know what the room's going to look like till you get there, you might, not know who your contact is till you get there. There was just so many open-ended pieces of that job that I had to just make it up and learn for myself and really see what worked with clients, really kind of try things out. They failed, try it out again, maybe failed again, but keep that learning journey going. And I basically was on that team, started it, helped it get ramped up. It ended up being only a couple folks. So eventually I had been doing it for a couple months and found that almost every single time we were doing a session, I was both being the person that set up, the whole experience of the room, from designing what the invites looked like all the way to kind of being in the room and taking the notes and kind of facilitating, graphically around the room. I was doing all of it, on top of which I was bringing that graphic lens, which I realized was a whole nother job. And so after doing it for about a year, I built up a business case of both client experience. So every session we did, we would do a survey, and there was 2 open-ended questions on that survey. What worked well, what would you change, something to that effect. And I just started tracking what people were saying about the visuals and, specifically writing my name on surveys, like that's what worked in the session, and realized there was so much energy from these clients from around the world, mostly because we typically put on meetings or sessions or courses that are one way, and maybe don't have that elevated experience of making sense of what people are saying. And I was bringing that into the room in instances where English was also the second language for a lot of folks. So visuals were really serving a purpose of clarity, simplification, and also like storytelling, across the world when we were doing this. So I built up a business case and brought it back to the same person that hired me into the greenhouse team, which was now expanding. Now it's a huge team, but pitched a full-time role of being what I termed the greenhouse artist. And my role would be strategically looking for ways to bring visuals and art to help elevate these experiences for our clients, not just for fun, right? Not just for that's a cool invite, but more so, how do we bring them into the live parts of the session where, tensions are high, confusion, can reign king, and like people are just talking past each other. How can we use visuals to help anchor everyone, bring it down, and make sense of everything? So that's the journey to that Deloitte role. I did that for a number of years, built out a team that still exists today, scaled a training practice globally, like had a great time doing it. But decided that I wasn't growing anymore after a couple years and was plateauing. If you're the best person in the room doing, your one skill set, eventually you're going to get bored, right? And that's a good thing, because you want to always be learning and changing and kind of challenging yourself. So it was a mix of realizing that every time I did a session, people were like, "This is valuable. We don't do this enough." Like, this session was valuable because now I have a visual artifact to say, this is what we talked about. And I basically realized that art could be a little bit expanded in how I was using it at Deloitte. So not just capturing visual sessions and creating good out of that, but bringing art into other pieces of our day-to-day life, whether that is with storytelling illustrations, whether that's with creating space through murals and other visual kind of techniques, and things I was doing at the greenhouse in smaller doses, but realizing like people are requesting this type of work, and I can only work with so many clients here. How might I expand what I'm doing and who I work with? And so it was a mix of all those things, kind of culminating in just deciding to take the leap, and sharing that with my team at Deloitte, once that decision was made, and really feeling very supported in kind of transitioning to that next step. So it wasn't like, okay, bye. It was very much like, I think I'm ready for this next thing. And one of my mentors was like, yeah, I was waiting for the day, like we knew this was coming. So, yeah, that's kind of that full journey from William and Mary to now.
Yeah, that's awesome. And there's so much there. Like, I definitely see what you mean by like speed and like just you have to be open to risk and failing and just the opportunity discovery there. So, when it comes to opportunity discovery, what was the opportunity that you specifically saw when you decided to launch Good for the Bees?
I would say that the biggest one I saw was that art has been used as kind of window dressing for a lot of things, right? Like when you think of marketing, when you think of illustration, it's kind of like on top of the content. And what I realized at Deloitte was art could be the tool that you use. And so the clients that I was working with, they were seeing value in the art, the real-time art I was creating. And so there was a big gap in kind of seeing art as this pretty object and then seeing facilitation as facilitation, right? And there's this sweet spot in the middle where you are missing a lot of the nuance of a conversation if you're not having someone be that capture, right? The person that's job it is to synthesize and create on the fly. And so I think that opportunity of really taking my expertise in not only the visual arts, but in deploying it in a really intensive environment with, C-suite executives, and being able to be very confident in front of a room with a blank slate and ending the day with a full slate, that skill set is something that I worked at over and over and over again, countless sessions. And to me, it's second nature now. And so I was like, why am I not doing this for clients that really need it, or for expanded clients, like working with universities? I collaborate with Columbia University on a course right now where we're doing that work on a virtual scale. So I actually taught myself how to do digital capture while at Deloitte, and expanded that through Good for the Bees, and do it very often now. But just like there were so many threads to that, having art as a tool that were not being touched on yet, that I thought I could bring to the market.
Yeah, that's awesome. So it sounds like your everyday can be very different. Like there's these different skills that you have to work on, and with new clients come new challenges. And so, what is one of the biggest challenges that you've had to face since becoming a founder, and how did you go about facing it?
That's a great question. I think one of the biggest challenges is probably around defining your value, and like holding tight to knowing the value you provide in an industry. The reason I bring that up is there are going to be plenty of people that maybe work with you and seek to undervalue what you're providing, possibly because they just don't understand it. So I think the bigger challenge is really about communicating what you can provide in a way that resonates with very different people. And so I'm coming from a place of, well, I'm in the art world, I'm in the facilitation world. So I throw these words out and guess people know what I'm talking about, right? And so I had to really kind of come to an understanding that how can I simplify how I talk about the value I provide, and visually show that, or show it through different mediums, so that when I am approached by a new client, they can understand it kind of wholeheartedly. What is really valuable is after someone goes through a session with me where I'm doing, let's say, live capture, or after someone sees a space transform with a mural, they get it. But at the beginning, it was really hard to show and communicate that transformation, because it's not a product, you know what I mean? It's a service. And so that is definitely something that I've worked on, and kind of, I'm sure I'll always work on it, but have been able to make a lot of strides in that communication of value, and, you know, visualizing it for different audiences, because ultimately you can have one or two or three audiences, like core, but the type of work that I do, I find I have a lot more than that. So I do have to kind of keep it at the highest of levels when I try to talk about the work I do. So yeah, I would say that making sure people understand your value, and also um, just communicating it in a very clear way. Those are one of the bigger challenges.
Do you have any advice for students who maybe were in a similar position as you, or like decided to go with a specific major because it led to a specific career path, and they realize maybe that's not something they really like or really want to do? Like, how do they go about pitching themselves when they're maybe transitioning, or just pitching the value that they can bring to a company? Like, do you have an example of how to do that?
Yeah, I think when I think back to the pitch for both the greenhouse artists, and now when I'm communicating value out to new clients, or just like cold clients, um, it really comes from a place of experience. And I don't mean like you have to wait 10 years, right, before you can do something, but more so, did you get creative with having an experience? Did you try to kind of seek out either speaking with people about their career journey? Did you seek out kind of trying out this career that you're interested in, or trying out this role, even in small kind of micro ways? I think that for folks that are kind of transitioning into something that they don't have on paper, that is okay, right? Like, how else could you get this experience? How could you volunteer your time to get it? How could you, you know, kind of just create a project and do it self-driven, and then have that example to show someone, right? I think having those something tangible to look at, whether it's in the creative space, you know, like a video, a picture, a something, can sometimes be what people need. But even more than that, it's just knowing that you're trying to work in that space already. I think when I think of the business case I built for the greenhouse artist role, I look back on it, I actually wrote it out. Like, I did I don't know, 5-10 page deck that I kind of explained what the role was, why I would do it, benefit it was going to give to clients, benefit it was going to give to Deloitte, you know, 5-year plan for it, you know, just a one slider on that. I look back, I hand drew the whole thing. So I was like, you know what, this is the value I'm seeing. Like, I might as well kind of do the work that I'm saying I should be doing, right? So I drew it out and basically used it as a meta tool to say, look, this is why it's valuable. So sometimes when I'm meeting new clients now, and they kind of don't understand what I could do for them because I haven't done it yet, I, you know, pull out kind of a case study, and I'll say, here's an example of what I did for the World Bank, right? Like, here's how we could transform your output to look like these 4 assets, right? On Twitter, on this, on, you know, so it's very much like, how can you show the work even if you haven't been paid to do the work yet? Um, and that for me also includes doing a lot of stuff ahead of time, like kind of do the projects you want to do more of. And so at Deloitte, obviously that was my side hustle, where I was like doing the visual capture that I wanted to make my real-time job, asking about it when I did it with clients, you know, getting that feedback, documenting it so I had it later to pull from and say, like, here's why clients like this, here's why it's valuable. So kind of pulling those data points, even if it's a project that you totally self-drive on your own and kind of create out of thin air, is really important.
Yeah, that's really great advice. So thank you. But I'm going to go ahead and ask our last question before we move into our Q&A, because I want to make sure we have enough time for everyone else to ask questions. But before we move into our last question, for those of you who are online, you're welcome to, when you ask a question, just like raise your hand and you can speak, or you can send it to me in the chat if you'd rather not say it out loud. And then for those of you who are in person, you just raise your hand and then I can call on you and the microphones will pick you up. But for my last question, based on your entrepreneurial journey, which one of our pillars of entrepreneurial thinking do you want to work on leveraging more, and why? And Amanda just throw them into the chat in case you need a refresher.
Yeah, that would be okay. I see them. Let me take a moment and think about this. I think, yeah, okay, I'm remembering them all now. I think when I was thinking about this, you know, as an entrepreneur, I looked at these, I was like, oh gosh, this is every day, right? Like there's so many of these things. I'm like, yeah, ambiguity is very much a part of my life. But when I see the improvisational one, I kind of connected with that one because especially during the beginning of COVID, I've dabbled in this space a lot, because, you know, I was newly putting out into the world, like, you know, our meetings are all very different than we've experienced. Like, you know, I was basically saying, here's a service that you could use to make sense of your meetings in a virtual, remote, digital way. And so I was doing a lot of visual capture remotely, and digitally. And so, like, instead of seeing me on the screen, you'd see, you know, a blank canvas getting, you know, filled up with the content of the conversation. And so, you know, I think back to, trying to put something out there and then basically having to change it and tweak it, you know, live and throughout the months that followed. But that's something I definitely want to continue to do in a more, proactive way. I would say that was reactive. So, as an artist, I put stuff out into the world all the time and get, you know, different types of feedback. But I think from a business service perspective, that is one of the pillars I would like to focus on more in the future, because I do think you can be very proactive with that. It doesn't mean you have to plan. Obviously, you're still improvising it. You're throwing it out and seeing what you get and how to change it. But the what you're throwing out there and kind of the why behind it, I feel like you have to be very proactive with that. So that one stands out to me as something I'd love to think about more in 2022.
Yeah, I'm glad that you chose that one. 'Cause I feel like a lot of founders don't choose that one, and it's really important. And I feel like, yeah, just like all the other pillars, we use them every day. But
Yeah.
yeah, thank you so much for sharing. I think we're in a really great place to start our Q&A. So I guess we'll start with Graham online because he has his hand raised. If you'd like to ask your question.
Awesome.
Thanks, by the way, for being here. It's been awesome to hear your story. I was struck also by the presence of grit in your story. I loved how you described the pitch to your boss, and then she says no,
Oh, yeah.
and then you just kept going, and then created that job anyway, and ended up, you know, making it your own. That was amazing. As the conversation has unfolded, it just strikes me how visual. Like, we're talking about a very visual thing, but we've just been hearing about it. I'm wondering if it's possible for you to share anything with us, like share the screen so that we could see, like, what's a good example of you know, visual capture or something that would help bring to life some of the things that you shared. Sorry to put you on the spot.
No, it's fine. I think my screen sharing is disabled, so I have to get that from the host, but I can definitely share some of that.
I just gave you permission. So
Okay, let me try again. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, so I just opened up my website. Let's see if this will show. Okay, so as an example, this is a visual capture from a conversation this time last year, actually, that the city of New York and New York City Design hosted. And it was all about kind of streetscapes for wellness. So how are we going to transition to this new world where we're living outside a lot more in the winter and the fall, et cetera. And so this was a conversation that happened on Zoom exclusively. And the conversation was very organic. There was not a lot of, there was not much that could be shared ahead of time. There wasn't like a framework we were going through. It was very much like we have these great guest speakers, which are across the bottom. And we're going to hear from them, right? We're going to hear what they think about kind of the current state, and we're going to hear about what's important going forward. So for example, the top part of this conversation, which is like very visual, lots of words, et cetera, that's kind of the organic convo, right? But just below it, you see like yellow boxes, be more transparent, build trust, focus on equity. Those were kind of themes that bubbled up after hearing the conversation, after hearing people kind of say it many, many times. So that's an example of a digital visual capture. Another one here, kind of a similar instance actually, where we had different speakers talking on one topic. So you see here it's how to fix culture. And you might be able to see recruiting, retain, and action. Those are kind of words that were kind of categories that kept coming up. Again, the conversation didn't say, we're going to talk about recruiting right now, right? But it's in hearing what we're talking about, how do we bucket it? How do we synthesize and make sense of it? So another digital capture. Let me find one that's not digital. Oh, this one's fun too. A lot of digital examples. But yeah, actually, a lot of these are from COVID, so they're very digital. Oh, this is William Mary. So I know you've had Beth on your series. So this was actually from Convocation a couple of years ago, and this was her speech, right? So again, something I don't have access to at a time. Even if I asked, I don't think that would make sense for something like this, but you can see there's a lot of conversation, but what should stand out to you is not only the title, so you see who it is, but kind of the green icons, the give yourself permission, make room for discovery, and own your own story. Those were like the three big things she kept coming back to. Plenty of content that's smaller and kind of important, but a little less important to me visually when I was creating this. But this was a capture of, her 45-minute conversation. Another example of the capture is something like this, where prior to COVID, a lot of the work I did, and a lot of the work I continue to do now, coming back from it, is in-person capture. So, having a whiteboard or foam core like here, having people have a conversation, and then in live and real time kind of capturing it. This was at the Boston Convention Center, actually, with Deloitte Digital and some guests. And so what you see up here at the very top was like the huge screen. It was like football field size screen. And the cameraman's like, okay, I'm just going to like come up behind you and like that'll be on the screen too. So that was funny because I didn't know that's what the setup was until we got there. So you have to be very flexible in this line of work. But just some examples. This was from a branding workshop at Temple University. You could see here how kind of color helps you see the categories, so not every visual capture is going to look the same. And that's kind of the point. We want to have things that are really meaningful to the group and to the experience that they're going through.
A quick follow-up to that, just as I see all of those examples, do you feel like your brain works differently than others to like hear something, you're synthesizing it in real time because you're not verbatim writing the words that you're hearing. You're actually then trying to pick out, that's a theme, this is an important topic. Like, is that trainable? You mentioned like standing that up at Deloitte. Like, can people learn how to think like that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, especially at Deloitte, and now I work with a lot of other corporate clients where I do a lot of training, you get that feedback all the time, like, well, I don't know how to draw, so I can't do this. The skill set of visual capture is trainable and is something that I've definitely taught others to do. I think like any skill, it's about repetitive practice. So when I look back to my work, that I pitched my, first boss with, that portfolio, like, it's pretty embarrassing to look at it now. I mean, it's great because I'm like, I came a long way, but I thought I was incredible. And I look at it now and I'm like, yikes, this is very rough. And that's actually a really good thing, right? Because that shows a growth mindset, because, you have to start somewhere, you have to keep growing. Feedback is very important to getting better at this type of work. So I put my work in front of so many different clients all the time and get feedback, as well as blind feedback. So I put it in front of people like friends to be like, what stands out to you on this? And they're like, this doesn't make sense. So there's a lot of that self-feedback loop that I make sure I get from the world. But to answer your question, it is a trainable skill. Synthesis very specifically is trainable, and visualizing and making sense of things once you synthesize them is a skill that I teach in my trainings. And I've done some trainings that are just kind of like hey, come for this hour to get the foundations of this work. What I've seen work better and what I do more of now, and what I did at Deloitte, was much more trainings that are designed to kind of happen. You go do the work, and then I come back and check in. And so right now, what I'm doing with KPMG's Innovation Center is I've done a ton of training with their team on the foundational level. So how do we get everyone skilled up in what this is, how to use it, in their environment. So not just for fun, right? But in your everyday work or learning, whatever that means for your team. So it's very tailored to like their day to day. So I have to understand that too, which it's convenient because I lived it for many years. So I understand how they could use it. But starting there, doing a lot of practice where I'm we're simulating this, right? Like, here's a video, we're all hitting play and we're going to do the capture, we're going to learn about it, we're going to give feedback, all of that kind of stuff, and then coming back in a couple of weeks and doing it again and again. That's where I've seen the best growth. And so I think people get very nervous, like, well, my stuff's not going to look like this now. And it's like, well, it shouldn't, right? Like, you haven't been doing this for 10 years like I have. So the idea of it is like finding your own visual voice, because how you use this might be very different than how I use this. And that's okay. It's a tool, right? So it's kind of like that longer term kind of learning is very important for this kind of skill set. You can't kind of do one training and be done unless you're practicing often. And so with KPMG now, what I'm doing is we've done that foundation, and they were interested in kind of still upskilling some of the teammates who were more interested in this. So what I did at Deloitte and what I'm now doing at KPMG is more of almost like an apprenticeship program where there's 5 or 6 people, did all the earlier trainings, very interested in keeping their growing, going. And we do deeper dives into like, how do you use color? What is color theory, right? Like, how do you decide which colors to pick for what topics? How do you prep your page? Like all those types of things, so that they can stand at a whiteboard and just kind of go for it and feel very confident. It might not look exactly like this, but that's not the point. So I think it's kind of a fun thing to look back on and think of all the different types of trainings I've done with this topic, because there are still people who email me today. They're like, hey, I'm still doing this work. Here's an example. And it's awesome because, people who practice will get good at this. It's just clear.
Thank you.
Hi, so thank you so much for talking with us today. This has been amazing. I'm curious to know how you gained the confidence to express information and sort of suggest your ideas in a way that's non-traditional, maybe not expected. So when you made the proposal to be a greenhouse artist and you said that you were using the way you're proposing to explain information visually in order to explain your proposal, how do you feel comfortable proposing that in a way that's not how people normally would take seriously a suggestion or an idea?
It's a great question. I think there's 2 parts to it when I reflect on that. The first would be, I already knew, I knew that there was value in how I was going to propose it because of seeing, other people experience visuals and be like, oh, wow, it makes sense now, right? For months. So I was pretty confident that what I was going to deliver, if I were to have put it in front of one of my clients from earlier, a couple months ago, they would have been like, yeah, this makes sense. So I think there was some practice there that I could look back and say, this is already an impactful way of communicating. Had I not had those clients, when I think of the first person I put, this work in front of, I would, I would imagine that it would be a little less confident, but still very much, I just knew that this was going to be something people valued because I had seen reactions to it, whether they're clients or just people in my life, right? So very much just like, I saw it work, I'm going to keep it going, keep pushing it. But the other side to that, I would say, is I knew no one had posed something like that to her before, right? And so the novelty of it being different, because I was really defining what it was. I knew there was no one like me pitching to her, right? And there's no one like you pitching to whomever. So kind of really owning what makes you different and having that come through however you're communicating is kind of key, right? Because if you personally, took my story pitch and tried to pitch it tomorrow, it might fall flat, right? Because it's not the same, it's not from your experience, but you could pitch something that I could not, right? So I think part of it is very much knowing what and why you're pitching, knowing what about you should come out onto that page or whatever, it might not be a page. That's really where the magic happens. And one of the tricks I use, which I had written up actually on my wall of my apartment on a Post-it, because I just knew if I didn't do it, someone else would, was literally, if you don't do this, someone else will. And that scared me enough where I was like, there's value in this role, work, tool, etc. So much so that if someone else figures it out before I get my act together, like, I'm going to be pissed. So that drove me to just do it. And I kept talking about it, and I'm like, okay, let's just do it. So I would say there's got to be a mix of that drive and a mix of you bringing yourself to whatever you're pitching.
That's great. Thank you so much. And I apologize. I have to dart out to go to class, but this has been incredible.
Thank you.
Any questions? I have one more question, but I was wondering, what's something that you wish you took more advantage of at William & Mary that you think really prepared you, or that you learned later on that you think you could have helped yourself out with a bit earlier on?
I think one of the things I regret, and I mean, you're a student, you guys are all students, you understand how busy life is, but I think one of the things I regret not doing more of was honestly going to office hours to hear about my professors' journeys. And the reason I say that is because, now as I'm pitching to different people, as I'm, every person I work with is so different and has like such a different experience, journey, background, etc. And I found that there's so much value in kind of understanding where someone in an industry has come from, kind of their journey, their story, because not only does it help me realize like I can do that, I can hop and figure it out because they did, but it gives you just so much more confidence that you are doing the right thing by following kind of your gut, your story. And so I think about a couple professors that I loved working with, I had incredible experiences with, and I think back and I'm like, I don't know anything about them, their journey. And so just like I kind of did as a really young person, reaching out to artists that were like living their life, I wish I would have done that with many of my creative professors as well as my history professors, to really just gain a different perspective on the kind of careers and things I could have done. Not to say I would have chose their path, but I think in college you get very wrapped up in like your network, your world, the groups you're a part of, your clubs. And professors sometimes are just like the people that teach, right? Like, and so I wish I would have kind of thought of them as more peer level, not because I'm a professor, but more because they were in my shoes at one point, and get some kind of nuggets of wisdom from them. That I would have done more of that.
Awesome, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
We might have time for one more question. If anyone has a question before we close out. If not, then thank you so much, Zara, for sharing with us today and for taking the time to be with us for our final AFS. I enjoyed it, and I hope everyone else who joined us today, I hope you all enjoyed it.
Thank you.